Last week, Descartes introduced us to a non-sensory source of knowledge, which he called a simple intuition of the mind. And Descartes argued that this non-sensory source of knowledge is superior to the senses, both in that it provides us with certain beliefs, and in that it reveals the essences of things to us. In the reading for this week, Descartes takes on a worry that has to do with truth. What we really want in our beliefs is not just certainty, but truth. We want to know not just whether there's any reason to doubt our beliefs, but moreover, whether our beliefs are actually true. So the question is there any reason to suppose that certain beliefs are likely to be true beliefs? Is there any reason to suppose that a belief that I cannot doubt actually corresponds with reality? To answer this question, Descartes considers the question of where our minds derive from. Descartes thinks this is relevant because if we know the source that our minds derive from, then we can determine whether our minds are well-made or corrupt. The thought being that a well-made mind would be a mind whose certainty tracks the truth, and that a corrupt mind would be a mind that's constituted such that it can achieve certainty with respect to falsehoods. Recall, this is an issue that Descartes put on our philosophical agenda back in Meditation 1. In order to achieve scientific knowledge, Descartes argued, we need to know both the source of our specific beliefs and the source of our minds in general. We need to know that the source of our specific beliefs is reliable, and we need to know that our minds are generally well-made. What Descartes is going to argue in Meditation 3 is that our minds are well-made because they were made by a perfect God. Before putting this argument forward, Descartes draws a number of philosophical distinctions that'll be important in his argument. The first distinction is among two kinds of thoughts, or two kinds of mental representations. One kind of thought is what Descartes calls an idea. For Descartes, an idea is like an image of a thing, and Descartes contrasts ideas with judgments. Judgments are more than just images of things. Judgments are relationships between ideas and reality, where the ideas are thought to resemble or conform to the real things. Now, Descartes explains that ideas cannot, strictly speaking, be false. My idea of myself, or my idea of my computer, or my idea of a griffin or a unicorn are all equally ideas. Now, if I were to judge that I exist, that judgment would be true, and if I were to judge that griffins exist, that judgment would be false, since, in reality, I really do exist, while in reality, griffins fail to exist. So the point is, because ideas are just like images in our mind, they all stand on the same footing. They're all equally ideas. None are true or false, since they don't refer to anything outside themselves. But judgments, precisely because they do refer to a reality outside themselves, can be true or false. Now, the second distinction Descartes draws is among our various ideas. Descartes distinguishes innate ideas, adventitious ideas, and invented ideas. For Descartes, innate ideas are ideas that derive from my own nature. Examples are my ideas of what a thing is, and of what truth is. Adventitious ideas, by contrast, are ideas that I acquire from things outside me. So examples are specific colors, tastes, and sounds. I come to have the idea of yellow only by seeing something outside of me, like a banana, that's yellow. The third class of ideas are invented ideas. These ideas derive from ideas I already have, either innately or adventitiously. So invented ideas include my ideas of a hippogriff, or a unicorn, or a merperson, for example. Now, the third piece of terminology Descartes introduces is degrees of reality. Now, at first, this might be hard to wrap your head around, because you might think something's either real or it's fake. But Descartes' thought is that things can be more or less real insofar as they're more independent or more dependent for their existence. So Descartes' thought is, X is less real than Y if X depends for its existence on Y, or if X depends for its existence on something from which Y exists independently. And correlatively, X is more real than Y if Y depends for its existence on X, or if X exists independently of something on which Y depends for its existence. So for an example, consider my hand and my fist. My hand can exist without being a fist. So my hand's existence is independent of my fist's existence. But my fist can't exist unless my hand exists. My fist depends for its existence on my hand. If my hand were totally annihilated, I couldn't have a fist. But my fist can be annihilated without my hand being annihilated. So in this sense then, my hand is more real than my fist. My hand lasts throughout the creation and annihilation of my fist. So I think it helps to picture this by drawing a line, where the line goes from what is least real on the left side to what's most real on the right side. So we could pick a point on the line to put me, or you. Something less real than me is my hands. Something else less real than me is my ideas. Right? The thought is, if I were annihilated, my hands and my ideas couldn't exist. But I could outlast my hands or any of my particular ideas. As I just explained, my fists are less real than my hands because my fists depend for their existence on my hands, but my hands don't depend for their existence on my fists. Something less real than my fists would be my fists' shadows, because my fists could exist without casting their shadows, but my fists' shadows couldn't exist without my fists existing. Something more real than me would be the number 5, at least on one understanding of numbers. The thought would be that 5 existed before I existed, and 5 will be around after I'm gone. Now, if there is a God, God would be located at the farthest right extreme on this line. For God would be a wholly perfect, and hence independently existing being. In saying this, I'm not supposing that God does in fact exist. All I'm saying is that if God were to exist, the place God would occupy in the continuum of reality would be the farthest point to the right, since God's existence would be wholly independent from anything else. Now, the last distinction that Descartes draws before presenting his proof for God's existence is a distinction between formal reality and objective reality. The thought here is that formal reality is the reality possessed by anything, including any representation, while objective reality is the reality possessed by what is represented in a representation. The contrast here is between the representational medium and the represented object. So for example, think of a photograph. We can ask, on the one hand, what is the photograph itself made up of? What's the medium or the material of the photograph? Perhaps the photograph is on glossy paper. By contrast, we can ask what the photograph represents, what the photograph is of, right? A photograph of the Eiffel Tower represents something different from a photograph of Buckingham Palace. They have the same formal reality of a glossy piece of paper, but they have different objective realities, either the Eiffel Tower or Buckingham Palace. And now, just as there are degrees of formal reality, so too there's degrees of objective reality. Of course, not everything has objective reality, because not everything is a representation. Not everything is of something. My fists, for example, aren't of anything. They're just fists. Photographs are of things, and so too my ideas are of things. So my ideas have less formal reality than me, and more formal reality than my fist's shadows, for example. With respect to formal reality, all photographs have the same amount of formal reality, and all of my ideas have the same amount of formal reality. Whatever the mental stuff is that makes up the medium of my ideas, all of my ideas are made up of that same mental stuff. All my ideas have the same medium. They all have the same formal reality. But just as photographs are of different things, some of which might be more or less real, so too my ideas are of different things, some of which are more or less real. So for example, I have an idea of myself, I have an idea of my fist, and I have an idea of God. My idea of God has more objective reality than my idea of myself, because God depends on less for God's existence than I depend on for my existence. My idea of my fist has less objective reality than my idea of myself, because my fist is more dependent for its existence than myself is. Now, Descartes articulates two causal principles. The second of these principles is a key premise in Descartes' proof for God's existence. The first principle Descartes articulates is that there must be at least as much reality in the cause of any effect as there is in the effect of that cause. The thought here is that something less real can't cause something more real. The cause of anything must be at least as real as that thing. Why is this? Well, the thought is the cause of an effect has to exist prior to and independently of that effect. But the cause of an effect can't be less real than its effect, because if the cause were less real than the effect, then the existence of the cause would be dependent on the effect, and so the cause couldn't exist prior to and independently of the effect. If we think, for example, that the existence of some smoke depends upon a fire, then it couldn't be the case that the smoke causes the fire. In order for the smoke to cause the fire, it would have to exist prior to and independently of the fire, and it can't if it's less real than the fire. Now, the second causal principle that Descartes introduces is that there must be at least as much formal reality in the cause of any idea as there is objective reality in the idea. So just as anything must be caused by something at least as as real as that thing, so too, the idea of anything must be caused by something at least as real as that thing. Take my idea of the color green, for example. The thought is, if I have the idea of the color green, I must have gotten it from somewhere. There must be some cause of this idea. Maybe my idea of the color green is caused by the color green itself. Maybe I've seen the color green, and that's the cause of my idea of the color green. I might not have seen anything green, but still have the idea of green. Maybe I've seen something that's blue and something that's yellow, and I tried to imagine what something would be like if it were equally blue and yellow. I might get the idea of the color green from my prior ideas of the colors blue and yellow. But could I have gotten the color green if I had never seen anything colored? Descartes' thought is, I couldn't. In order to have an idea of a color, that idea must be caused by something at least as real as the color. And quite generally, in order to have an idea of anything, that idea must be caused by something at least as real as that thing. As I said, this is the first premise in Descartes' first proof for God's existence. The second premise is that innate in my mind is the idea of God. This is the idea of an infinite, eternal, immutable, and wholly independent substance. Descartes' premise here is not that God really exists. That premise would beg the question, since God's existence is what Descartes is aiming to prove. The premise is simply that I have the idea of God in my mind. The premise is that I know what the word God means. I can understand the sentence, God exists, and I can understand the sentence, God does not exist. The meaning of the word God is an infinite, eternal, immutable, and wholly independent substance. But now, Descartes thinks it follows from these two premises that God must exist as the cause of my idea of God. His reasoning here is that, since I have the idea of God, since this idea has maximal objective reality, and since an idea with maximal objective reality could be caused only by something with maximal formal reality, there must be something with maximal formal reality. In other words, there must be something that is a wholly independent substance. And since God is defined as a wholly independent substance, there must be a God. God must exist. So your papers now should consider whether this is a valid and a sound argument. Questions to consider are whether we really do have innate in our minds the idea of God, and whether the idea of God really is the idea of a perfect being, a being that is wholly independent for its existence. When considering these objections in your paper, you should imagine how Descartes could best reply to these objections, and whether you think these replies would be satisfactory. But now, Descartes offers a second proof for God's existence. Why does he do this? Is there some problem he sees with his first proof for God's existence? Well, remember Descartes' overall goal in Meditation 3. Descartes wants to show us that our certain beliefs are likely to be true, since our minds are well made, in that they've been made by a perfect God. So far, Descartes has shown that God exists. But what does this have to do with our minds? Is there a good reason to think that God exists and created our minds? Could it be that God intended to create the world, including our bodies, and that our minds are epiphenomenal? Our minds are just an unintentional byproduct of God's creation of the world. To show that this is not the case, to show that God designed our minds, Descartes needs to show more than just God exists. Descartes needs to show that God created our minds. And this is what Descartes does in his second proof of God's existence. This proof begins by considering the various sources our minds could have derived from. The first premise is that my mind could derive from itself, from a cause less perfectly real than God, from multiple causes less perfectly real than God, or from God. The second premise in Descartes' argument is that my mind does not derive from itself, since I am not aware of generating my own existence. Implicit in this premise is that I have conscious awareness of all of my mind's actions. The third premise is that my mind does not derive from a cause less perfectly real than God, since innate in my mind is the idea of God, and the idea of God cannot be caused by anything less perfectly real than God. The idea behind premise 3 is what we've already gone over in Descartes' first proof for God's existence. If we grant that we have innate in our minds the idea of God, where this idea has perfect objective reality, and if we grant Descartes' causal principle that an idea must be caused by a source that has at least as much formal reality as the idea has objective reality, then it follows that the idea of God cannot be caused by anything other than God. The fourth premise in Descartes' argument is that my mind does not derive from multiple causes less perfectly real than God. And Descartes' reason here is that my idea of God is a perfect unity. The conclusion of this argument is that my mind must derive from God, since all of the other possible sources have been ruled out. Again, your papers might consider objections to this argument, and if they do, your papers should canvass the best possible replies Descartes could give to these objections, and then determine whether these replies are satisfactory or unsatisfactory. But now, the payoff of meditation 3 is that if my mind was made by a perfect God, then my mind must be well made. In particular, my mind must be made such that my certain beliefs are likely to be true. Descartes himself takes on an objection in meditation 4. The objection is that since sometimes we are in error, our minds must not be well made, and hence must not be made by a perfect God. So if you think this is one of the most compelling objections, you can discuss this in your paper. And again, you'll want to consider Descartes' reply and the extent to which you think it's satisfactory.